It begins with a single statement, destined to divide Catholic opinion the moment it was published. Inclination alone should not be a barrier to the priesthood. And then, standing directly opposed to it, a second statement, issued years earlier by the Church herself. The Church cannot admit to the seminary or to holy orders those who present deeply rooted tendencies of a certain kind. Two positions, a yes and a no, addressing the exact same underlying question. And the genuinely remarkable thing is that both statements come from within the same Catholic Church, separated by 2 decades and by very different sources of authority. By the end of this video, you will understand why these two positions cannot simply coexist as two valid pastoral approaches to the same reality, and above all, what the Church's own official teaching has already stated with considerable clarity on this exact question. Begin with the first voice, presented here honestly and without caricature, because fairness requires that his actual argument be represented accurately, rather than reduced to a straw man. This is Father James Martin, a Jesuit priest who has become, over the past decade, one of the most visible and most consistently discussed voices in the English-speaking Catholic world on questions concerning ministry to people with same-sex attraction. In July 2026, he returned to this subject publicly, calling once again for the Church to reconsider its current policy regarding admission to seminary formation and ordination for men who experience this particular inclination. His reasoning, and this needs to be stated with precision because misrepresenting it would serve no one, does not call for any abandonment of clerical celibacy. It explicitly presupposes chastity as a continuing requirement. The priest he envisions would live his entire priestly life in full continence, exactly as every ordained Catholic priest of the Latin Church is required to do, regardless of his particular orientation. Martin's actual argument is narrower and more specific than critics sometimes suggest. He argues that the inclination itself, considered in isolation from any question of behavior, should not by itself be sufficient grounds to exclude an otherwise qualified candidate from priestly formation, provided that candidate commits to and actually lives a chaste and celibate life exactly as the Church already requires of every priest. In support of his position, he cites a specific remark, attributed to Pope Francis, who at one point spoke of holy, healthy priests who happen to have this particular sensitivity and who serve the Church faithfully within it. This is, for Martin's supporters, a significant piece of supporting testimony, since it suggests that at least one recent pope acknowledged the existence of such priests without treating their existence as inherently scandalous or as evidence of institutional failure. Martin adds a further and more recent development to his case. He notes that Leo XIV received him in a private audience and offered words of encouragement regarding his particular ministry to this population of Catholics. For Martin, this meeting represents a sign of continuity, evidence that the highest authority in the Church does not regard his work as fundamentally opposed to the Church's own mission. Here, though, precision matters enormously, because accuracy in reporting this story is everything. Leo XIV did not change any existing rule regarding seminary admission. He did not sign any new document altering or superseding the Church's established policy on this question. He met with a specific individual and offered encouragement regarding that individual's pastoral ministry. This is a meeting, not a magisterial act. It carries the weight of a papal audience and the personal warmth such an audience can convey, but it does not carry the weight of doctrinal or disciplinary change, and treating it as though it did would be a serious misreading of what actually took place. We are discussing, in other words, the public request of a single priest, however genuinely influential and however widely read his commentary happens to be within contemporary Catholic media. We are not discussing an actual decision made by the Pope himself to alter existing Church policy. This distinction is essential to understanding everything that follows, because Martin's request runs directly and unavoidably into conflict with a specific document the Church has already produced through her own formal deliberative process, And this is not merely one document among many competing and equally weighted opinions floating within contemporary Catholic discourse. Move now to the second position, the one that stands in direct tension with what Martin has proposed. In 2005, the Congregation for Catholic Education, the Vatican dicastery specifically responsible for overseeing priestly formation programs throughout the world, published a formal instruction addressing precisely this question, following 5 years of careful and deliberate study before its eventual release. This was not an improvised document, hastily assembled in response to a passing controversy or a single news cycle. It was personally reviewed and approved by Pope Benedict XVI on August 31, 2005, and formally published on November 4 of that same year, following a process of consultation and drafting that had begun years earlier under his predecessor. That document establishes, without significant ambiguity, a clear and specific standard. The Church cannot admit to the seminary or to holy orders those who practice acts contrary to chastity, who present deeply rooted tendencies of this specific kind, or who actively support what the document describes as the associated culture surrounding those tendencies. This is stated as a matter of settled church discipline, rather than as one pastoral option among several equally legitimate approaches available to individual bishops or seminary rectors to apply or set aside according to their own personal judgment. And here arrives the portion of this discussion that almost no commentary on either side of this debate takes the time to actually explain with care. Why did the Church arrive at this specific conclusion in 2005? Not, the document itself insists explicitly, out of contempt or hostility toward any individual person or category of persons. The instruction is direct on this specific point, and its own stated reasoning deserves to be represented accurately rather than assumed. The reasoning offered centers not on judgment of persons, but on the objective nature of the priesthood itself, considered as a specific vocation with specific requirements that the Church believes she has received from Christ rather than invented on her own authority. The priest, according to this understanding, is called to function sacramentally as a spiritual father, configured specifically to Christ as bridegroom of the Church. And this vocation, the document argues, requires a particular kind of full affective maturity, including a settled, peaceful, and rightly ordered capacity for relationship with both men and women. A capacity the instruction identifies as foundational to the specific pastoral role the priesthood requires, regardless of any individual candidate's personal holiness or sincerity of desire to serve. This, according to the document's own stated framework, is what the 2005 instruction is actually addressing at its core. Not a condemnation of individual persons or an assessment of their worth as human beings, but a specific requirement attached to a specific vocation, applied according to the document's own text to every candidate for that vocation without exception, regardless of the particular form any individual candidate's affective immaturity or unresolved struggles might happen to take. The Church, the instruction insists, demands the same standard of affective maturity from every man who presents himself for priestly formation, and this uniform standard of application is precisely what the document's defenders argue distinguishes it from discrimination directed at a particular group. It is instead presented as an exercise in discernment, applied consistently across every candidate considered for ordination. Because admission to seminary formation, the instruction reminds its readers explicitly, has never been understood within Catholic tradition as anyone's automatic right. It is instead framed as a process of careful verification, one in which the Church herself bears the responsibility of evaluating whether any given candidate's vocation is genuinely authentic and sufficiently well-founded to sustain the demands the priesthood will eventually place upon him across an entire lifetime of ministry. Here, then, are the two positions finally brought together and placed directly beside one another, without the softening language that often allows commentators to avoid actually confronting the contradiction between them. On one side stands the argument that the inclination itself does not matter, that chastity alone is sufficient, and that a man who commits to living continently should not be excluded from priestly formation simply because of an orientation he did not choose and cannot easily alter. On the other side stands a formal church instruction, stating plainly that a deeply rooted tendency of this specific kind is itself, independent of any question of chastity or behavior, an impediment to admission. These two positions cannot simply coexist as complementary emphases within a single, internally consistent Catholic approach to priestly formation. This is not a matter of pastoral nuance, where reasonable people of good will might simply be emphasizing different but ultimately compatible aspects of the same underlying truth. It is a direct yes versus a direct no, applied to the exact same specific question. Either the 2005 instruction, approved personally by a pope after 5 years of careful deliberative study involving multiple Vatican dicasteries, remains valid church teaching and continues to bind seminary formation programs as written, or it does not. There is no coherent third position available that manages to affirm both propositions simultaneously without collapsing into contradiction, however much diplomatic language might be deployed in an attempt to bridge the gap between them. And here the discussion needs to move to a second and equally important level, one that is frequently forgotten or deliberately set aside in contemporary commentary on this subject. The 2005 instruction did not emerge from nowhere, and it was not the product of sudden or unreflective prejudice hastily assembled in response to a passing cultural moment. It emerged specifically from a painful and well-documented institutional experience. The years of clerical abuse scandals that had already become public knowledge by the time the instruction was drafted had demonstrated, with devastating clarity, precisely what can happen when careful discernment at the point of seminary entrance is neglected or deliberately set aside in the name of a supposedly more welcoming and less discriminating admissions policy. The instruction represents, at least in its own stated self-understanding, an attempt by the Church to protect two distinct goods simultaneously through the same careful standard. First, the priesthood itself, so that it might continue to be and to represent what the Church believes it is meant to be, an office requiring a specific and demanding kind of affective and spiritual maturity. And second, the individual candidates themselves, so that men whose particular psychological and spiritual formation might make the specific demands of celibate priestly ministry genuinely unsuitable for them, are not led, in the name of a false and ultimately harmful welcome, down a path that could produce serious and lasting damage both to themselves personally and to the communities eventually entrusted to their pastoral care. It bears repeating that this was not a decision reached by any single Vatican official acting alone or according to personal preference. 3 major bodies within the structure of the Holy See were directly involved in its preparation, and a full 5 years of sustained deliberative work passed before the completed text was finally released to the Universal Church in 2005. This was, by any reasonable standard of institutional decision-making, a carefully considered and thoroughly deliberated conclusion, rather than an impulsive or poorly examined position adopted in haste. And the Church, within that same instruction, articulated a principle that continues to hold regardless of whatever contemporary pastoral pressures might argue for its revision. What is genuinely at stake in this specific question is not primarily sympathy for any individual candidate's personal desire to be ordained, however sincere and however deeply felt that desire might be. What is at stake, according to the Church's own stated reasoning, is the good of the entire community of faithful eventually entrusted to the pastoral care of anyone who receives holy orders. Because admitting a specific individual to a form of life for which he is not genuinely suited, the instruction argues, does not constitute an act of authentic charity toward that individual. It places him at real risk, both personally and spiritually, and it simultaneously places at risk the flock he would eventually be called to shepherd, who depend on their priest's genuine affective and spiritual stability for their own pastoral care and formation in the faith. This, then, is the fundamental difference separating the two voices at the center of this entire discussion. One position looks primarily, and understandably from a place of genuine pastoral compassion, at the individual candidate's own personal desire and sincere sense of vocation. The other position looks primarily at the objective nature of the specific gift being conferred through ordination, and at the good of the entire community that gift is ultimately meant to serve across an entire priestly lifetime. But considerable care is required here to avoid a serious misunderstanding that too often accompanies discussions of this specific instruction. The Catholic Church has always maintained, consistently and without exception, a clear distinction between a person and that person's particular inclination or tendency. Every human being, without any exception whatsoever, possesses infinite and inherent dignity as a creature made in the image of God, and is loved by God completely and without reservation, regardless of what particular inclinations or struggles that person happens to carry through no fault of their own. The negative judgment expressed in the 2005 instruction is not, and was never intended by its own authors to be, a judgment on any individual person's fundamental worth or dignity as a human being created and loved by God. It is specifically and narrowly an assessment of suitability for one particular ministry among the many forms of service and vocation available within the life of the Church. These are two entirely distinct levels of consideration, and confusing them, treating a judgment about suitability for a specific vocational calling as though it were instead a judgment about a person's fundamental human worth, causes real and unnecessary pain to people who are already navigating a genuinely difficult and often isolating personal situation, without adding confusion about their own basic dignity before God into the mix. But precisely for the sake of maintaining this necessary clarity, and precisely out of genuine care for the people this discussion actually affects, that specific negative judgment regarding suitability for priestly ordination cannot simply be erased through a catchy public statement, however sincerely intended, or quietly set aside on the basis of a single papal audience, however warm and encouraging that meeting may genuinely have been for the individual involved. Established church doctrine and discipline cannot be revised simply because maintaining a difficult position has become socially uncomfortable, or because sustained public pressure over time has made the existing standard feel burdensome to defend in contemporary cultural conditions. The priesthood, according to the Church's own consistent self-understanding across every century of her existence, is not a career path chosen freely according to personal preference, nor is it a form of social recognition or status conferred as a reward for sincere religious devotion. It represents, in Catholic theological understanding, an actual configuration to the person of Christ himself, calling a man to become, in a specific sacramental sense, a spiritual father to souls entrusted to his care. And fatherhood, understood in this specific theological sense, carries genuine and non-negotiable conditions attached to it, exactly as every serious and demanding vocation within human life and within the life of the Church has always carried its own specific requirements and prerequisites. No reasonable person, after all, considers it a fundamental injustice that other serious vocations within the Church, religious life, the diaconate, various forms of consecrated life, similarly require candidates to meet specific and sometimes quite demanding qualifications before they are formally admitted. This is not contempt directed toward those who do not currently meet a given vocation's specific requirements. It represents, instead, basic institutional seriousness toward what is actually being received through ordination, a genuine spiritual gift that does not ultimately belong to the individual recipient himself to define or redefine according to his own personal judgment or preference, but belongs instead to the entire Church, whose faith and whose sacramental life that gift is meant to serve across generations. And this consistent standard applies equally to every candidate who presents himself for priestly formation, regardless of his particular background, his personal history, or the specific nature of whatever affective or psychological struggles he happens to carry into the seminary admissions process. The Church, according to her own stated self-understanding in this specific instruction, does not close this particular door out of prejudice directed against any one group of people. She guards, instead, a genuine threshold, because what lies beyond that threshold, the sacramental configuration to Christ himself, as shepherd and spouse of his Church, is understood within Catholic tradition to be too significant, too consequential both for the individual priest and for the community he will serve, to be approached or granted casually or without the most careful possible discernment. True charity in this specific and admittedly difficult context, according to the framework the 2005 instruction itself proposes, does not consist simply in saying yes to every sincerely expressed personal desire, however genuine and however deeply felt that desire happens to be. Authentic charity consists instead in genuinely willing the real good of both the individual candidate and the entire Church he hopes to serve, even in circumstances where that real and lasting good ultimately takes the painful and difficult form of a clear no, rather than the welcoming and inclusive yes that contemporary cultural sensibilities might otherwise prefer to hear. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Amen. God bless you.